Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining this month's edition of the CNU member-led webcasts. I'm Jay Shepley, Membership Engagement Manager with Congress for the New Urbanism. CNU is an international nonprofit organization working to build vibrant communities where people have diverse choices for how they live, work, and get around. We believe that well-designed cities and neighborhoods are crucial for our health, economy, and environment. We build places people love. And on today's member-led webcast, we have joining us Distinguished Research Professor in the Department of Urban Planning at UCLA, Donald Shoup, and Eric Kronberg, co-founder and principal of Kronberg Wall Architects in Atlanta, Georgia. And this month's edition is on parking. So we brought Donald and Eric in because Donald is a renowned researcher and professor who deals with parking, and Eric is a developer in Atlanta who works a lot on solving real-world parking problems in cities. So first of all, welcome Eric and Donald.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
So we'll get started, and I wanted to start with Eric. On your blog, you write about how parking requirements can significantly undermine the efforts of developers who are seeking to do economically viable new urbanist redevelopment in cities and towns. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about some of the ways that Kronberg Wall has been able to overcome the limiting effect of parking requirements through placemaking. Have you had successes working with city governments to find real solutions to land use challenges, or is this something that you're frequently finding yourself trying to invent on the fly?
No, we're actually blessed in Atlanta with, in spite of what people may think, a city that's getting really progressive on parking. And so it's been an incremental improvement. But one of the things we find is that we've got to start with our clients first and help set and verify their expectations for parking from the beginning, because there's obviously a market expectation for parking and then there's the zoning. We can modify the zoning from a parking perspective in Atlanta to just about whatever we need at this point. But getting the clients to understand what they need that's step one, because if we can get the parking constrained and organized, then we have the ability to work on a really good project. And honestly, with today's construction costs and land prices, you are hard pressed to do a viable project without reducing the parking. So we start from creativity first, whether it's on street or otherwise, but that is the beginning to make something work. And the city of Atlanta, just in terms of policy, they did a zoning diagnostic a little over a year ago, which was great, where they started and said, let's look at all the problems with our zoning. And they definitely focused on parking for part of it. And they said, our zoning is completely inappropriate from a parking perspective. So now when we go in for a parking reduction, we can justifiably use our zoning as our hardship and say that is the thing that we're facing, that is the problem. And the city doesn't bat an eye, and most communities are getting on board. I mean, we just took a parking reduction through for a 1,500 space reduction from over 2,200 spaces to 750 in an existing parking lot with very, very little pushback at one community group, and everybody else was unanimous in support. So that's the new norm for Atlanta.
That's interesting. I remember you talking with me about all the traffic in Atlanta and some of the parking issues. So it sounds like there is actually, pretty progressive policy in place there to ameliorate some of these parking issues.
At least in the city. The suburbs still have to figure a lot out, but in our, urban core or regular, original town from 1929 on, where we have, streets and MARTA and other things, the cities realize that they need to get out of the way in parking policy, and they're taking great steps forward.
That's great. So I think we'll turn this one over to Donald now. And this is actually from fans on Facebook in the Shoupistas group. If you're not following that group, it's a really cool group. And Donald, I'm curious if there are any areas in behavioral economics, or this is what the Shoupistas group said. I'm curious if there are any areas in behavioral economics that you see as hopeful ways to convince places to take a more thoughtful approach to changing parking policies.
Well, that is a great question that I hadn't thought of until you asked me. And in behavioral economics, one of the important issues, what they call loss aversion, is that people are much more worried about losing something they have than about gaining something they don't have. that it makes for the status quo, that people don't like to have any change that might involve a loss to them, even though the potential gain is very great, like having a beautiful city or cleaner air, or maybe even delaying global warming. So those things would be nice, but they're hard to use them to convince people that they ought to give up free parking, and plenty of it. So in my book, The High Cost of Free Parking, to summarize 800 pages in 3 bullet points, I recommend 3 things. One is to remove off-street parking requirements, but to make that possible, I also recommend charging the right price for on-street parking, meaning the lowest price the city can charge and still have 1 or 2 vacant spaces on every block. And then to make that politically possible, I recommend using the revenue to provide local public services on the metered blocks, such as cleaning the sidewalks every night, repairing the sidewalks, adding historic street furniture. Boulder gives a free transit pass to everybody in the metered area. Some cities give free Wi-Fi to the metered area, so that they will, the metered area will see an immediate benefit paid for by the parking meters. Old Pasadena in California is a perfect example of that, and it has a good link to new urbanism. It was a very prosperous shopping area through the 1920s. But then there was the Depression and World War II. And then in the 50s, most places had plenty of free parking. So Old Pasadena declined for about 50 years. There were wonderful buildings in terrible condition. And people thought it might never revive, but there's a complaint that there's not enough parking, of course, because they hadn't provided a lot of off-street parking in the 1910s and 20s. So the city wanted to put in parking meters to replace the 2-hour time limits, and the merchants all said, no way, that'll chase away the few customers we have. And they argued for a couple of years until the city said, well, if we put in the parking meters, we will spend all the money to repair your sidewalks and add historic street lights and clean the alleys. The merchant said, that's different. Why didn't you tell us that? Let's run the meters till midnight. Let's run them on Sunday. Let's charge a high price. And the only thing that changed was instead of putting the meter revenue into the city budget, it went straight out the other side of the meter and fixed up Old Pasadena. So I think that showing people, giving them a vision of what they can have if they charge the right price for curb parking and effectively removed off-street parking requirements, brought them around. That they did lose something. They lost free parking at the curb, which was mainly used by the merchants and their staff who moved their cars every 2 hours to get free parking. So I think that loss aversion is very important. You have to think about how you can overcome the fear that you're going to lose something that you have, which is plenty of free parking. So I think, getting back to behavioral economics, it shows why it has been so difficult to reform our parking policies, is that everybody wants to park free, including you and me. But that doesn't mean we should make this a policy of public finance and public transportation. I think if we provide something directly to the stakeholders in terms of money from the parking meters, then it's more likely that we'll be able to remove or at least reduce off-street parking requirements. And then we will get a lot of other benefits. We'll get cleaner air, we'll get less traffic, we'll have fewer accidents, we'll have better pedestrian life, and all those other things that really I think new urbanists care for more than they care for parking meters. But uh, but it isn't those general benefits that will convince people to say you'll have a more beautiful city and your children will grow up in a healthier environment. I think most merchants are worried about not going out of business the next month or going bankrupt in tough times. So you have to appeal to their self-interest and their immediate self-interest, and then that will align with long-run goals about that the new urbanists have expressed so well.
That's a great segue into the second part of this question. And it's the converse. And what stats or data do you find most effective in convincing places to modify these parking policies to move towards something that is a little more effective in terms of economics and land use?
Is that me?
Yes.
I see. Well, often statistics are not very helpful. Sometimes you need bar graphs or pictures. I think pictures are very good. And comparisons. I think one that I think is very compelling is that for a concert hall downtown, like Disney Hall, that most people have an image of, the minimum parking requirement in Los Angeles is 50 times higher than the maximum parking allowed at Louise Davies Hall, its equivalent in San Francisco. That is, LA requires at least 50 times more parking than San Francisco allows. And you think at the end of a concert in San Francisco, everybody streams out onto the sidewalks and all the bookstores and bars and flower shops are open. It's a long way to your car if you drove. But in Los Angeles, there's 6 levels of underground parking with a grand escalator cascade up to the lobby, and people never set foot on a sidewalk going to most people never set foot on a sidewalk going to a concert at Disney Hall. Once my wife and I ate at a restaurant about half a mile away, and it was in the summer. We walked up to Disney Hall. It was very pleasant. When we walked back to the restaurant where we had parked, we were the only 2 people on the sidewalk, and it was a almost frightening experience. So I think that things like that, that comparison, I think makes people in Los Angeles feel a little bit guilty, I suppose. Also, figures like that Los Angeles has more parking spaces per square mile than any other city on earth, and we have the worst traffic congestion as well. So you can't say that more parking is going to reduce traffic. But otherwise, I'm very data oriented and have done a lot of analysis of data, but in speaking to public audiences, no, I don't think that data is that useful. And I think it's also sometimes the problem that the opponents of any kind of reform are the loudest voices in the room, and they're the ones who attend public meetings. Once I was in Santa Rosa, a very nice town in the wine country, and they had a beautiful city hall with auditorium seating, and they had invited me to talk about parking. I lectured for about an hour with plenty of data, and at the end they asked people for questions. There was a guy in the top row who jumped out of his seat, and he wasn't foaming, but there must have been spit because people were recoiling, and he said, I had recommended something very mild, is that their meters ran from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. and then there was a big dinner scene, and there was a terrific shortage of parking in the evening. But the meters were empty. The metered spaces were empty in the morning because most of the shops weren't open. So I said, I had recommended that the city should start running the meters at 10 p.m. and 10 a.m. and then running them as late in the evening as needed. So this guy jumped up and he said, if this city operates the parking meters at evening, I will never come downtown to a restaurant again. And he thought that settled the question. There was nothing more. There were no response to that complaint. So, and there were about 150 people there and all the politicians. I said, well, if you don't come downtown, the space you would have taken will be occupied by somebody who is willing to pay for parking. To park. Who do you think will leave a bigger tip at a restaurant? Somebody who will come downtown only if they can park free after driving around for 20 minutes, or somebody who's willing to pay for parking? And you may get a better deal at the food court at a suburban mall with ample free parking. And the whole audience began laughing and clapping and cheering. And I think it takes an outsider like that who's got nothing at stake to combat opposition like that, not with data, but just with personal experience. You know, a politician or a planner or Eric couldn't get into a fight with with a citizen in a situation like that, but I could. And whenever I go to a restaurant, I always ask the waiters, where did you park? And if it's in a place like Santa Rosa, they'd say, oh, I try to get a metered space around 5 p.m. and then I can park free all night. and just think that it'd be a lot better if those waiters parked someplace else and the curb spaces were available for customers. So even the waiters will be better off if we run the meters in the evening and the spaces are taken by customers who will help the businesses and the waiters, provide more tax revenue and everything else. A lot of people can be better off, but you have to show somebody that they individually are better off. And in Santa Rosa, they eventually did change the meter hours, and they began spending the revenue on the metered streets.
Hey Jake, I want to do a follow-up question if I could. Yeah. on the data side. And Professor Shoup, in your latest book, I'm trying to remember, but did you guys run any data or analysis on the revenue generation for like Old Pasadena or otherwise in terms of how much the meters were making and being invested back in place as a potential way to convince people of benefits of paid on-street parking?
Yes, it's about $1.5 million a year for an area of 15 blocks. And they were very smart about how to convince people at the beginning, and I think in 1982 to do it, is they had hired a graphic designer showing the improvements that would come about, and they put a label on all the meters saying, I think it's turning small change into big changes, or this money goes to pay for sidewalks, street lights, alley improvements. And they also borrowed $5 million against the revenue to immediately rebuild all the sidewalks and plant new street trees. So they didn't wait for the money to accumulate. They started spending it right. Even before it came in, they borrowed money because you could borrow against meter revenue. But even after paying the debt service on the meter revenue, they had $700,000 a year to pay for added police protection, and they steam clean the sidewalks twice a month. And I think nobody would now we're thinking, getting back to loss aversion, nobody would think now we're better off if we didn't have all the sidewalk improvements and cleaned up the alleys and all the historic preservation investment that occurred later on. We wouldn't be better off if we had free curb parking and none of these other things. So I think, you do visual preference surveys, and I think it's important to show people or find out what people want most and say, here's a way to pay for it. So maybe not even mention parking reform at the beginning. Just say, what do you want? What is your, showing them pictures of other projects that you've done, and then ask them if they want it, and then say, here's a way to pay for it, and we'd have to have a reduction of the parking requirement. So Pasadena got rid of almost all of its parking requirements, so they prohibit parking on Colorado Boulevard, off-street parking on Colorado Boulevard, because they don't want cars driving across the sidewalks. I think if you show them an area with a lot of curb cuts and an area with no curb cuts, but great street trees and street furniture, I think you could convince people without a lot of data. I think probably visual evidence is the best.
I'm really interested in this example of Pasadena, which kind of leads me to my next question for Donald. And in your book, The High Cost of Free Parking, you talk about the many virtues of charging fair market price for public parking, writing that no other source of public revenue can so easily bring in so much money and simultaneously improve transportation, land use, and the environment. We've talked a little bit about Pasadena, but I'm also interested in other real world examples. Can you talk about an example of a city or town that really got this right and other ways that they may have benefited?
Well, there are several of them. I think Boulder, Colorado does almost everything right, is that they use the meter money to offer free transit passes to everybody who lives or works downtown. So all employers have a tax-exempt fringe benefit they offer their employees at no cost to themselves. So it makes downtown a better place to work, and it greatly reduced solo driving to downtown and increased transit ridership, of course. And it helped the transit system, because I think in many places we lack transit riders more than any other thing. That we have transit systems, but they don't have enough riders to make it profitable. They also, getting back to the new urbanist routes, they require that the parking structures be wrapped with active uses, not just on the ground floor, but at the upper levels with the first 10 or 20 feet, I think. I was at speaking in Pensacola recently during the Gulf hurricane, which was exciting, but that they had a new building that is called a Texas Donut, where is apartments on the outside and parking on the inside. Well, Boulder has that, except usually it's on the front and the side. The back of it, facing an alley, can be left to look like a parking garage. Beverly Hills does that too, on a more overblown scale. It looks like a Baths of Caracalla from the outside, but it's a parking structure with a facade, not active uses. So I think that what are some other cities? Washington, D.C. is beginning to charge, which is already quite beautiful. They're beginning to charge market-based prices in the Chinatown area. Ventura, California had a nice downtown that they put in parking meters in the 50s, and people rebelled and voted out the city council and the mayor. And it was in the DNA of the city that at least of the politicians, that they should never put in parking meters again. But it was a consultant recommended parking benefit districts, and they put it in, including free Wi-Fi for on the metered streets. So that if you had meters, you had free Wi-Fi. So that, I think, if around the world parking meters became identified with free Wi-Fi in the neighborhood, it would change the view of charging for parking.
That's fascinating. I think our state and local government members could have a lot to gain from learning about how all of that would work. That's something I haven't heard before. I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk with Eric. And I'd like to ask you kind of about your evolution as a designer, as a placemaker. During the CNU Legacy Charrette in Brunswick, Georgia, we saw firsthand how your team really takes a holistic approach in analyzing all the different factors at play when you're designing a place and talking about, how that can benefit a community in need. I'm just interested to know, and how have the ideas advanced by Donald Shoup and other influencers in new urbanism informed your approach to design? And could you give an anecdotal example from your work of how something from new urbanism or Donald's work really tied into something that you were working on or a problem you're trying to solve?
Sure. So, as a younger firm, we spent a long time working on urban redevelopment, adaptive reuse, and parking was always something we solved for, but we didn't necessarily owned the solutions in that. Like, we knew we kind of did something, we just did. And when I read High Cost of Free Parking, gosh, probably 4 or 5 years ago, it was literally like the clouds parted and angels came out with trumpets. And it was like, there's this revelation of, here it all is. Everything we sort of thought kind of was a problem laid out beautifully and succinctly. And that gave us the ability to really own and master the space from an urban redesign standpoint. And understanding where parking requirements come from allows us to demonize the requirements and not be demonized by communities, and help explain to folks, this is why it's inappropriate, this is why we don't have nice things. So Donald's book was just pivotal in understanding how urban redevelopment works. And so that cannot state enough how much that really helped us. And just in terms of a short anecdote, not even for a specific project, but we've done so many parking reductions in the city that it's just kind of just a matter of course now. But we put a lot of time and effort into a parking justification document that we include Donald's 6 steps to plan for pre-parking. He's got a great little flow chart diagram and high cost free parking, and we put that in every application to help the city planners understand where this is coming from, because there's always new staff that don't understand. And so we use that as a teaching tool for the city. And our cities, the Office of Zoning and Development, they've been really great risk takers trying to get ahead of these things. And they've always been supportive if you can convince the community. So understanding how to talk to citizens about how the projects we do will provide benefit to them, but we can only provide these benefits if they work with us on parking, changes the conversation. We're not coming to take something by not providing parking. We're coming to bring something beneficial, and just having that tone and expectation, it changes the entire conversation. It doesn't mean people aren't upset. They still can get upset, but more and more citizens understand where we're coming from and realize the benefits. And so this has been foundational in helping us do better projects and convince communities to let us do those projects in their neighborhoods.
Excellent. This is another one in from Facebook for Donald, and the question is simply, any meditations on an incrementalist timeline for parking policy change?
Well, I believe in small changes. I think you should think big, act small, and move fast. But I think that some things are happening faster than I imagined. Say Buffalo and Hartford both remove all parking requirements in the city. I never thought that would happen so quickly. Some cities have switched from parking minimums to parking maximums, with the new maximums lower than the previous minimums. That I think sometimes in urban planning we make U-turns so fast we don't remember that we used to be going in a different direction. Once we thought urban renewal was the thing, to demolish everything and build anew, and now we're into historic preservation. Or we thought that the solution to the low-income housing was to build high-rises. Now we believe in scattered site housing. So I think that looking back at that, I think the planning profession is capable of changing its mind. And I think there are more younger planners who come along, and they realize that in planning school, they were never taught how to set up minimum parking requirements. There's no theory. There's nothing. The planners are winging it when it comes to parking requirements. They're really not wedded to them. They're just used to them. And they've been there since before they were born. So how could they reject them? I mean, you can't, if the Planning Commission asks you to recommend the parking requirements for a nail salon or an animal grooming studio, you can't say, well, I don't know, or I disagree with them, or there shouldn't be any parking requirements, because you'd be fired. But I think there are a lot of younger people, when they encounter parking requirements now in planning a school, realize that it prohibits them from proposing the low-income housing project they wanted, or anything they want to propose when it comes to the parking requirements. They realize that this makes it impossible. And then, this high cost of free parking, published by the American Planning Association, and an old guy in the profession came along saying this is all dangerous nonsense, these parking requirements. So I think younger people are beginning to be very skeptical and open to proposals from Eric and others who can show the benefits at the local level, as they say about science. So science marches on funeral by funeral. I don't think that I'm going to convince many older people about what I'm saying, but I think younger people will replace them, and they'll be open to proposals, especially if they're backed up by Eric and other architects and designers who could show graphically, well, this is what we could do, and if we don't have to meet the minimum parking requirements.
Well, thank you, Donald, Eric. This has been really fascinating and enlightening, and I just really appreciate your time and giving people some perspective on your work. I wondered, Eric, do you have any kind of parting questions or thoughts for Donald?
Oh man, well, I wanted to give a shout out to a couple things happening in Atlanta really quick, just in terms of incrementally how a city can do better. And I just love how it can be Atlanta that's helping change perception, because we're such a perceived suburban sprawling place. But we're working on a second round of zoning changes that include some really great stuff. One is we're working through parking exemptions for all buildings built before 1965, which is awesome because that was when Atlanta instituted parking requirements. They've also done nuking all parking requirements for buildings with a half mile of a heavy rail station, which is our MARTA, or bus rapid transit, which we don't have yet, but we're planning for. They're allowing us to do on-street parking requirements, or these are all proposals that are almost through the full process. And lastly, which I'm really excited about, is we helped them craft a specific infill zoning category for missing middle housing, which we've never had before, but they included a parking requirement of half a space per unit, which is appropriate for infill, particularly when you're in a neighborhood with on-street parking, because then your on-street parking will count and you don't have to provide any parking on site. And or if you do that near transit, you don't have to do that. And or if you renovate an existing building, you don't have to have parking. And since most of our work is adaptive reuse in buildings built before 1965 near transit with on-street parking, we're triply excited for all this stuff going on. So, and I think, again, it goes back to a lot of Professor Shoup's writing in this and helping me advocate with the city to change perspectives. And, even the notion of the date of 1965, they were kicking around dates of 1929, 1930. And I was like, the later the date, the more good we can do with it. And our Beltline, which is, a transformational project for our city, most of the warehouses around the Beltline were built in the early 1960s. So this really unleashes and unlocks all these buildings become much more valuable than the, underused sites they are. So these changes in Atlanta have so much to do with, the high cost of free parking and advocacy we've been able to do. So we're excited about Atlanta, and I love I got my question in about the dollars for Old Pasadena, and I think, pretty pictures and budgets to fix things and have nice things. I think that's a great component. I also wrote down the comment "Science Marches On." I'm going to share that later. It's a great way to approach it. I love it. But thank you guys so much for the chance to do this. I'm so excited and appreciative of a chance to talk with both of you.
Yeah, thanks. Same here, Eric. So everyone, please check out CNU.org to learn a little bit more about new urbanism. Don't forget to pick up Donald's book, The High Cost of Free Parking, and check out Eric's website, KronbergWall.com. There's a lot of great information on there, blogging and all the information about Kronberg Wall. So thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks, guys.